Welcome, welcome. For the sake of our digital audiences, I'm going to get us started quite promptly on time. Thank you, everyone. Welcome. Thanks so much for joining us this evening. This is a delightful turnout. I'm so pleased to have you all here for this evening for an artist talk and reception to mark Lyse Lemieux, So Dawn Goes Down Today, and the accompanying essay brochure that we have with this lovely exhibition. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Katherine Dennis, and I'm the curator here at the Art Gallery at Evergreen, at the Evergreen Cultural Center. With the intention of respect and relationship building between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, I'd like to acknowledge that the Evergreen Cultural Center and all the work that we do takes place on the core territory of the Kwikwetlem First Nation. The Kwikwetlem people have lived in their traditional and ancestral territory, known as the Kwikwetlem watershed and the surrounding area, since before remembered time, and they never ceded this land. The Evergreen serves the surrounding region, colonially known as the Tri-Cities, which is the shared territory of the Musqueam, the Squamish, the Tsleil-Waututh, the Stolo, the Kaikite, and the Katzie nations. In sharing this land acknowledgement with you this evening, I would also like to recognize the ongoing colonialism and racism against Indigenous peoples. As a third-generation settler who has recently moved with my young son to this community, I recognize my responsibility in proactively working towards decolonization. Words without action are meaningless. This is an ongoing and imperfect process of learning and unlearning, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to do that work. This evening, we will have a conversation with Lyse Lemieux, live streamed for those who could not join us in person, so hello digital audiences. Followed by a casual conversation over a beverage and the opportunity to purchase those brochures who are interested in owning your own copy. It's available for sale with Kim, who's at the back right now, at our gallery desk for only $5 plus GST. And if you're lucky, maybe Lyse will even sign it for you.
Sure. Definitely.
For our in-person audience, time permitting, we will take a few brief questions, but we want to allow time for socializing as well this evening. For those watching at home, please note that we are not able to take virtual questions tonight, and so this is presented as a seminar format. Thank you for tuning in. It is now my very great pleasure to introduce Lyse Lemieux. Making art for more than 4 decades, Vancouver-based artist Lyse Lemieux works across mediums, such as drawing, painting, installation, and sculpture. I always love the facial expression of an artist as they get their bio read and sit in tremendous discomfort with their great accolades. I will keep it brief. Lyse has exhibited her work extensively nationally and internationally, including solo shows at the Burnaby Art Gallery, SFU Gallery, the Contemporary Art Gallery, and Richmond Art Gallery. Lemieux is represented by Willabally Art Projects in Vancouver. She was the 2017 recipient for the Viva Award from the Doris and Jack Shadbolt Foundation for the Visual Arts, celebrating her outstanding achievement and contribution to the field. And I promise you're going to hear more from Lyse than me tonight. So without ado, let us dive in.
Hi, Katherine.
Hi, Lyse. All right, well, sitting here, surrounded by your paintings, and given the premise of the exhibition, I think we must begin with color. What drew you to the proliferation of hue when so much of your past work has foregrounded black?
It has in the past foregrounded black and white. But you know, there was always a lot of color, and it was always through fabric. And so in my mind, and in fact, there were a lot of my drawings and a lot of the works on paper that I did had tons of color. But I think most people later on, just what I started exhibiting again, there were mostly black and white ink drawings on paper. Coming out of the pandemic, or during the pandemic actually, at home, when Al and I were, my husband and I were not going into the studio, we stayed at home worked out of our apartment. I was working much smaller, and I was working with pencil crayons a lot on paper. And so I was doing a lot more color, I guess. And then once I did go back into the studio, I didn't even think about it, but I just started, well, 2 things happened. One, as I started painting on canvas, something I had not done since I was in school, and I started using a lot more color. And so I was working a lot bigger, and I was also working with a lot more color. And I don't know why, actually.
Well,
It just came naturally.
Well, let's talk about intuition then a little bit. What draws you to the colors? When we're sitting behind Lyse Lemieux and we see this vibrant orange, where do you begin?
Well, actually, that's right. So all the works that are here, that are not on canvas, were all done before the pandemic. So forget everything I just said. So much for that theory. So actually, the works on UPO, that are all the works that are not on canvas here, with UPO being a plastic recycled paper. I did during, I think, what are the dates? You probably remember the dates better than
2018, 19.
Thank you. Is that right? Are they that late?
Yeah,
Oh.
that series.
Oh,
But pre-pandemic still, so you're right.
I'm just totally confused. Maybe you should ask somebody else all these questions. Yeah, I probably started them like 2017, probably earlier. And so there's lots of colors in those. And there's still a lot of them have fabric or stitching and sewing through the UPO, which is a really great paper for all the artists here who want to use it. What was your question about intuition? Right. So really, the paintings really were an extension of the work I'd been doing on paper. And intuitively, well, the color is just, sometimes you just think of color and it just comes to you. And that's what happened with pretty much all of these paintings. Is I actually really do dream of colors sometimes, and I wake up and I want to paint a certain color. I think a lot of artists are the same way, and certainly painters are. I don't think of myself as a painter, but I think that that's probably what happens, is you get in the same way that I get a feeling for line and fabric and texture. I want to hold it, and I want to be with it, and that's a way of doing it, I guess.
Maybe let's carry that through line into sculpture, and in particular the connection to the colored column that we have here. So everything else sits on the wall. We have work on paper and on canvas, and then we have anchored the exhibition, so to speak, with this column. How does that fit into you for this exhibition?
Well, you have anchored this piece, and I was so thrilled that you wanted that piece for this show. That was really important to me, and to me it really connects. All of these works are connected, and they're connected to it, and it connects to the work. I think it does in terms of color. I think it does in terms of texture. It certainly about the body, even the grid. I just thought it was a really smart thing of you to want to bring this in here and in this show, because it really does bring it all together. And this piece was first shown at the Richmond Art Gallery in a show I had there in 2017. Is that right? Was it 2017?
16.
16, right? It's good. It's good to have a curator around. And it was conceived for the Richmond Art Gallery, and it was conceived to go right up, as it does here, up and meet the ceiling. And it didn't quite do that in Richmond. So it had a different type of life over there. And so I'm really happy with the way it is here as well, because it really does go all the way up and kind of disappear into the ceiling. So, but the connection, to answer your question, is, so it was important because I still think of myself as a person who makes things, and it was important to have that connect with these works, because as you can see, a lot of the paintings too, where the painting is not just on the surface, but it wraps around, and not that there's anything new in that, but it's very important for me in a lot of the works, where the line and the paint just does continue and wrap around, and that's, I think it gives it a sense of objectness that is important to me when I'm making these works.
I highly encourage everyone to spend an opportunity to look at the Lemieux series, which is behind us over here, from the side, so you do see those beautiful edges. Because for where I'm sitting right now, all I can do is see the edge of the couple here with the column and that connection between the fabric and the patterning, and that relationship's really evident. But it's such a gorgeous line to see the treatment and the kind of the sculptural way you approach your paintings there.
And I think it really is about the line too, and maybe that's why the grid is, or was, when I went back into the studio and I started painting these works, the ones on canvas, I made them, and then I felt this constant need to bring the line on all of them. And I'm not sure if that was just like, if it's just a kind of a sense of security that I have about wanting to bring that line in front of everything, or if it was wanting to look through something. Still trying to work that one out.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about the grid and the way that has evolved for you over the different series. So in this exhibition, we are pulling from work 2016 being the earliest with the sculptural piece, but the works on the wall sort of 2018 through to 22. And we see a sort of evolution of sorts where the grid starts to take form kind of right at the entrance of the gallery in one of our earliest works. And we see it here behind us in Untitled Piecrest Forest. But it shifts and morphs throughout the paintings all the way to Dorsal. And you've spoken to me before about your thinking around the grid and its relationship. And I'd love to hear you share a little bit more of that with the audience.
Well, as I say, it happened quite naturally in wanting to. Maybe it was also, I'm thinking this through actually as I talk. It might have had something to do too with wanting to cover it up, being unsure of where all this was going. So as I say, I'm still trying to figure a lot of that out. The works I'm doing now don't have grids anymore, so I don't know what that means. They're there in different ways. I think it's also about, I really do like just drawing lines. And I like drawing, and I think maybe it was bringing that element into the activity of painting. Yeah, and I'm thinking that through again. I think too that is part of why bringing that line around the canvas is also, it gives me great pleasure to do that. Maybe that's all it is. It's just about what makes you happy, you know.
I love that. There's a few.
I thought you were drawing a line there.
This is me with my responsive listening, so I'm just making notes. Well, there's a few thoughts that I wanted to pick up on there. And the first is maybe the relationship to digital. You know, this popped up, and I had no idea until Lyse came and did some really wonderful training with our educators here and talking about how using digital technology has informed your use of the line. Tell us a little bit about that.
Has it? The digital part?
The digital part. Well, I'm thinking of the angel, the l'ange, and the lines there. And you had spoken about using...
Oh, yes. When I was... Sorry. When you mean when I work on the computer and then I go back? Yeah, that's true. There's two things about the... It's so good you're there and reminding me what I do and how I do it.
I hope I'm remembering right.
Thank God, Catherine. I'm going to have to take you with me when I go back to the studio.
My pleasure.
I do go back, two things. I do, so l'ange, which means the angel, which is the blue, with the blue ground, the one that has the droopy wings, was an ink drawing that I did, that I had done, a very large one, just about as large as that one, on paper. And then I wanted, and I redid it on canvas. And then in order to figure out, not always, but in order to figure out some of the colors, I do work them out on the computer. I try things out, nothing fancy and nothing complicated, but I'll try things out. I'll try like a color on the background, so I photograph it and then I put it into Photoshop, and I might try certain areas out in color before I do anything. So it never gives, I'm not that good at it, and I don't necessarily want to be that good at it because I don't want to reproduce what I've done digitally. It's not how I work, but it's a way of testing out and sketching out mostly color. And yeah, so there's that. Then the other thing is I do take my paintings, my pieces transform a lot. And Al always jokes that he comes into the studio and I've done something and he'll never comment anymore because he knows that it'll probably be 8 or 9 or 10 more iterations of the same thing. So it's not always true, but generally that's true. So I do photograph, not always, but sometimes I photograph the different stages of that. And I thought that's what you were going to refer to when we were talking about the piece over in the back, Une conversation entre moi et moi, which is the red piece on the other side there, which had started out as an ink drawing and shaped into and became a very, very different piece. But yes, it's true. For a number of pieces, not, as I say, not all of them, I do test things out on digitally first. Yeah. Did I answer that?
You did.
Oh.
Yes, I think so.
Okay.
I'm thinking about the iteration now too as I look over at Dorsal, La couleur de mes mots, which is just on the wall over there. One of the newer works in the show, and one that looked very different when I first saw it.
Was it really
No,
that
well,
different?
Well, yes, I think it was,
it?
because there were no dots.
Oh.
So maybe let's talk about the dots.
Oh, there were no dots at all?
There were no dots, and there was yellow.
What was yellow?
Some of the dots. Well,
the dots were yellow?
The spots were yellow that are now red.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
It's true.
Yes.
That's true.
So maybe you want to share some insight
into... It's hard
into...
to remember all this, you know. Don't you think? It's hard to remember what we do. Do I want to talk about the dots?
The dots or the painting?
The painting?
What do you think?
It started, actually, you know how I told you, I found this the other day when I was looking for that other painting that I sent you. It started out so differently than this. It started out as a figurative piece, like really figurative. In fact, Will has the painting that I was working from, the drawing. He has it up at the gallery right now in Vancouver. It looks totally different, and I'd forgotten that. And so it became, but it kind of had this figure that was going up onto the canvas. So the blue part that you see now, which is a dorsal, spine, was a figure. And so, but I do know, but I did, when I did the figure, I realized, oh no, it shouldn't be a figure, it should be a spine. And so it quickly became a spine. And, but it took about, that was the longest, that took about, I think if I were to look at the dates, I think it was about 6 months where it changed right up until it came here, where the little kind of berries appeared, the red berries and the dots.
And the dots.
And the dots.
Well, maybe let's talk a little bit about the process for the dots or what those signify for you. We've talked a little bit about the meditative process. Can you speak a little bit more about, we've talked about the line and the grid, where do the dots factor in to your painting process?
They started, for sure, I'm sure about this. They started back during the pandemic when we were working at home and I was doing small crayon and pencil drawings. And they're very, very obsessive and very, very meditative. And so I think I carried that through, and I'm still doing that. When the gesture or when there's this kind of, I can only do it physically, when there's this kind of feeling of painting, then the work is like this, and the gestures are like this. And then when there's when there's a need to sort of be closed in, then the gestures get smaller. It's pretty straightforward. So I think that's what happened was during, when we were in lockdown for that period of time, I think I just kind of went like this, and it was very soothing, and it was very, very much what I needed to do at that time. And then I got into the studio, and things kind of went back up like this again. And but that need and that, again, satisfaction to go in and be able to do both is an important one, I think, for me, for my process. And yeah. And I think it also relates to my interest in fabric, in patterns, which is still a very, very strong for me and very necessary in the work. And so in many ways, I think what I ended up, what I'm painting now is often, you could even think of the grid as being, you know, the warp and the weft of fabric, but a very maximized macro view of that. So I do think it relates back, and fabric, and relates back to clothing, and clothing relates to the body. So there's kind of there's a gradation there, and a common interest and a common concern.
And I know many folks in our audience will be familiar with your practice, but some may not be. Maybe to tell us a little bit more about where that interest in fabric kind of originated from, and as the through line in your career.
Yeah. I'm guessing that it originated from, because, you know, what do I know? You haven't told me yet, so you tell me if I'm right.
I'm saving it for the end.
No, seriously, I think back in the 80s, long after I graduated, and had my studio, and one of the things I started doing was a tunic, a uniform. So in French, the word is tunic, and just the little uniform black things. And so I worked with this shape and this concept for a long time, for a very long time. And eventually it kind of made its way into an interest in clothing. I realized, well, the tunic is also clothing, and it's the body, and that's where it kind of all originated from. So there's been an interest in clothing and what we wear, and especially for women. When I grew up, in my family with my mom, clothing was very important and had a certain status, and it carried literally a great deal of weight, not always a positive one. And so I think there's a lot of the sources come from there.
It's an interesting thought about the weight, a weight of fabric, as we look at the column, and just the volume of the process of collecting. So maybe you talk a little bit. I love the story about this
going
this
around
piece actually,
finding.
coming together. I'm going to share a little.
The story Catherine's referring to is when I was collecting, because I did, I had to collect a lot of shirts, and they're mostly men's shirts, and so I went around all over the Lower Mainland, literally in every community, secondhand shops. And I think it was when I was in North Van, and I would gather up all the shirts and walking around like this with all these shirts. And this woman not far, I could see her talking to somebody going, "That's the woman. She buys all those shirts." So they just thought I was some sort of weirdo collecting all these shirts. So I think I must have, so what we have here are, and I did other things with the actual shirts, but the column, the column is plackets, shirt cuffs, and shirt collars. Yeah.
And interestingly, mostly of men's clothing, yes.
Well, they're men's shirts mostly, because they're mostly out of cotton, and they usually have the most patterns. Whereas women's, there are women's shirts here too, but mostly women's shirts are often either synthetic, at least the ones you see in the secondhand shops, or like in, in the Salvation Army shops where I was buying them and stuff. So there are some they're mostly really bad fabrics. Not fabrics, but yes, like they're not cotton and they're not substantial. And I would end up buying mostly the shirts. And I like the grid, the plaid and the gingham and so.
I think with longer time, there's something that we could unpack there about the relationship of men and women's clothing.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
I want to bring it around to the body because I'm thinking about that where, and there are many in this show, but where there are forms that have perhaps a gender, they are usually identifiable as a female gender, or there is no gender necessary. And so I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the way gender might influence the forms or not with all of the bodies in this exhibition or in your practice.
Or they're creatures that have...
Or both.
Or both. Or they're creatures that have like erratic kind of breasts and penises and things that don't quite belong. Yeah. I don't even know what to say about that. I find that more and more too, making figures that don't necessarily have any kind of gender, and that don't necessarily make any sense, that are either mythological. I did do a series of these mythological creatures. Is again very pleasurable, but it's also very accessible, and that's important to me. But they're also a lot of them are, for example, the yellow piece, this piece here, this painting here, I'm always surprised when somebody says they hadn't seen the figure in that. And many people tell me that, so it's clearly that it's not so obvious. But to me, I painted it and realized, I didn't realize, I thought it was very obvious that I was painting a pregnant woman with a tight dress on and her hands on her hip, but apparently not. So, yeah. So, and I like that they can become more abstracted too.
Lyse is one of those artists that you can really easily quote. When she starts talking, there's always gems every time we have a conversation. And one of them, when we were speaking, you mentioned that your interest was in bodies that, quote, question what they are. And I love that. It's really stuck with me throughout the whole show and thinking about the different forms and the way that arms and appendages and faces are presented. But maybe you can talk a little bit about that interest in the body and why it comes back to the body, really, in all of the work.
Yeah. Again, I think it comes back to having grown up in a family where clothing was really important, where clothing was going to define you or not define you, or it had a lot of weight, and it always seemed important when it shouldn't have been. And so maybe turning that around a little bit and having more, giving it less weight is one of the reasons for doing that. But also I think I grew up in a time where we were all thinking about, women my age were thinking about not wearing dresses, or we were thinking of how we could not be feminine, and it was a time when it was very much at the forefront of who we were and defining ourselves and who women were in society generally, and so it's the notion of, I don't think we can say hermaphrodism anymore. I don't think it's the right term, but certainly of not having to think too much, or quite the opposite, thinking about gender and bringing it in on every kind of level is of great value, I think, to certainly to me and certainly to the iconography I work with. And it's also a playful, I like to be able to play with that and get away from some of the serious discussions that we must have around that. So I probably didn't answer your question there. Sorry, Catherine.
Well, it's interesting because it's not something that we've actually talked about much
No.
before. We haven't kind of
No.
gone that route in our
Yeah.
conversation, and more where things have taken us, I think, of late is the relationship to the body, and I'm thinking of Dorsal, but just in your experience of painting the body, your relationship to your own body, how kind of that is playing out in your work.
Yeah, especially with that piece, where that's the largest one I've ever done. It's the largest painting I've done. And I really had to, I had to get up on a ladder to do it, and moving it around was actually, I could spread, it's as big as my arms will spread and that I can move. Anything bigger I won't be able to move on my own. So that was really interesting. And the idea of the spine is just, it was physically, these are concerns for me too, so it was very much about my own body. So I was really painting it. It was both, that's a painting that's really about, as I was talking about earlier, where there's this really big gesture that's outside of me, physically having to make it, and then maybe that's where the dots come in, and then going back in, and having to be really intimate and really up close with the painting. So it's this back and forth again, but it's physically, and that's the great thing about working on canvas, on larger canvases compared to smaller pieces of paper, and maybe that part relates to the work I do sculpturally, and the work I do with public art too, is it's just it takes up my whole body, and I like that. I think I'm a very physical person. I used to dance when I was younger, and maybe that is part of how I work. It's an important part of the process, is to be able to use my body. So it reflects in the content too, I think.
Yeah, that's sort of thinking through making and all. Yeah. And this is my fair warning to the audience that I'm going to turn it over to you in a moment for questions if there's something on your mind. But I wanted to sort of bring us around to maybe more of an observation than a question, but what's resonated for me with this exhibition is that when folks come in, there's immediate energy to it. People walk in and they're like, oh, yes, wow, there's color, there's visual stimulation, there's a lot to look at, there's a lot to dive into, and it's this really immediately positive response, which has been wonderful. But on the contrast, or in addition to, as the more time people spend with the work, you start to see some of perhaps the anxieties, some of the darker creatures, some of the questioning that's in the work. So I think there's a lot of pleasure that you've talked about in the work, but also attention there. And I don't know if you have any comments that you want to add to that, but I wanted to share that observation of how we've seen people kind of react in the exhibition and spend time with the work.
Mm-hmm. Well, you've probably seen them more than I have, because I'm not here as much as you are, obviously. No, I think I don't have much to say about that, other than that it was really interesting for me to see these pieces together, because these were all works, the paintings were done, there's very different moments in time here, and so it was interesting for me to see how much color there really is, because I never get to see them like this in my studio. And yeah, no, it was just, it's a privilege to be able, for an artist to be able to see her work in this context, in the context of conversations that can happen between works and connections that can be made. So that's I thank you for that. Yeah.
Well, it was a lot of fun going to your studio and pulling out works.
That was fun.
Yes, that was
fun.
It's always a good time. It's a lot of pleasure in my job that way. Questions from the audience? Anything you'd like to ask Lyse this evening?
That's good, because I don't have the question. I don't have the answers. Hi, Elizabeth.
That was fun. I'm curious about your relationship, together, the two of you, in terms of choosing the work. Like the idea of pulling it out, and Lyse deciding what to pull out, but also what to put together, because there's a lot in the show, right? There's a lot. So I'm curious about that process. How much was Katherine, how much was Lyse?
I'll just reiterate that for our digital audiences, just that Elizabeth was asking about our relationship in putting the exhibition together.
Well, I just took everything out.
She did.
I just
had a lot
pulled
of fun.
literally, I pulled everything out. Katherine, as I recall, right from the beginning, you knew that you wanted the collared column.
I did, yes.
So that was a given, which I was really surprised about, and I was really excited about, because as I said earlier, I just wanted that connection. That was a great thing to do, I thought. But I just pulled everything out, and you seemed to know what you wanted, like that.
We come back to the intuition. I do love the column, and I do love to have a lot of fun in here. And I think it's the space to have that and to experiment with some things and see how they work once you get them into the room. And I think the Evergreen and our audiences are up for that kind of approach, which is really wonderful. I think with Lyse's work, I think it's always intimidating to try in a space of this size to span projects, especially with an artist who's prolific like Lyse is, where it would be more straightforward to pick a series and exhibit that in its entirety. But it is less of a challenge, and so that is less fun. And Lyse early on asked me to write an essay, which I had the space to do this summer, and that was really satisfying, was how would I articulate the through lines? What stories could I tell? How would I pull out the connections that I see in these works? And they're all connected, as any artist practice is, but they are also distinct and unique, and trying to kind of make that case for the relationship. And so one of our educators said to me she was surprised that I had taken a formal route, starting with color. And I was thinking of it, as I'm not a particularly formal person, nor am I an expert in painting. And I think there are very much experts in painting who really think about painting in a particular way. But I was really interested in the significance and the conceptual approach to color and what that meant. And your practice has been often discussed in writing often a lot about the black and white, the line, that relationship to drawing. So this was a really fun opportunity to do something a little different.
So the fact that you knew that there was an essay, did that determine, because you decided to have like the UPO drawings in there, was that part of trying to make those links? Would you have done that anyway, I guess, is the question.
I think they happen simultaneously, so I don't know that I'd say one came before the other. I think, but it was a process of making, how would I make the connection between the family series and Dorsal, and then think about that in relationship to this column, and then the works on paper. And so it was a satisfying way, because sometimes I don't get to articulate those connections until you see the work in the exhibition. And that doesn't happen until installation. It's too late to write something. So this pushed me to articulate it, I think, a little bit more clearly early on, and that was a lot of fun. And Lyse is a great conversationalist. So that's really where it all comes from, is just the conversations, which has been
we
such
had a lot
pleasure.
of conversations, yeah. And again, that's the privilege, is you get, when you have the opportunity of doing these kinds of shows, or a show like this, and there is an essay, then you are forced to start articulating things that are always just intuitive, that you do intuitively in the studio, and especially if it's over 4 or 5 years worth of work. So, yeah. So the answer is Katherine did it all.
Other questions from our audience? David.
It's great to see all this work together. Thank you. One thing that strikes me about the figurative work is there's a lot of distortion. And I wondered if you could, things are scaled up, they're stretched, they're distorted. And I wondered if you could talk a bit about the grotesque and what that means in relation to the work.
I'm just going to very quickly summarize for our digital audiences that the question was about the distortion in the figure and the relationship to the grotesque.
It's just the way I draw. It really does come down to that. It's, I think, in the same way that if you look at, I think even the ink drawings are always about that. So it's just, I think that's my mark. It's not deliberately wanting to be grotesque, but I understand what you mean by that. It is more about, I'm guessing, we keep making our work to figure out why we do it and how we do it and where it's going and how we're going to keep at it, right? So as I travel that, it's a really good question. I am not sure what my relationship to it is. I just know that it is the only way I know how to work, in the sense that if I do anything else, and I've wanted to do other kinds of marks, but when I do, they're not honest, they're not mine, and yeah, they never end up staying. So I think, I'm just looking as we speak. I often too, one of the things I haven't said too is a number of these paintings are taken from sections of paintings I've looked at. So you would never know them. They wouldn't resonate as that at all anymore. But or even works I've made. For example, the leg at the end is a work on felt that I did, and it exists in another form as well. So. And these drawings, this series here, all existed on paper first. They were all ink drawings. So, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, sorry, it's not much of an answer, but.
A final question from the audience. We have time for one more. Everyone's saving it for over. Oh.
Oh, the complicated lives of kings and queens. I can't remember, Catherine might, what date that is, but I think it's, anyway, it's a few years ago. And I was just thinking about, I've been thinking a lot about kings and queens and what that means. Not lately in terms of the queen dying, nothing like that, way before that. Just about the roles of hierarchy and of leaders and what that means, and the irony and the cynicism perhaps around all of that. And so this is, I do also a lot of collaging, and oh, that's another thing too, that I do a lot of collaging, and then I might rework them as paintings, so they might have started out as a collage, and that could help. That might be part of the distortion. Yeah, and this piece was just about that. It was about the chaos and the wars and the which is very much on my mind these days. And even though that was made a few years ago, and I'm still using a lot of felt, not always in the work. That's another relationship to the work. I'm just remembering, like the black lines on the back, that those were, where I used to use felt and cut the felt. It's a very nice thing to paint that same line. Yeah. So sorry, I can't tell you much more than I knew. That's one of the rare ones where I knew what the title was as I started making it. Usually I don't always know that, but this one I knew exactly what I wanted to make. Yeah, and in fact I had never shown it, and I was quite surprised when I pulled it out and you wanted to include it, because I don't think it was, I made it not ever thinking that it would get really shown anywhere. It was just one of those things that I made for myself, I think.
Oh, I like to get to surprise. That's nice.
Yeah.
It's fit really well here.
It does.
It does.
Yeah.
Yes, I think it actually brings in a lot of the connections and things that we've been talking about, with the fabric and the patterning, the dots, the bodies, and the way they move, how the line is starting to come in and take over. It sort of has this idea of almost like flames at the bottom, but not. And it does give me that sense of perhaps anxiety or the tension. There is that in it. It's really rich and vibrant, but there's a discomfort in that painting that we see in other works in the exhibition. I want to thank you all for joining us for this lovely conversation. It is always a delight.
Thank you.
I want to invite you all to stay and enjoy a beverage, a little snack, pick up your very own copy of our lovely brochure. This is for my digital audiences at home.
And this is
Again,
where the
away.
essay is. We should say that Catherine's essay is in the brochure. So.
Yes, the essay is in the brochure, a few beautiful installation shots. I do want to always do a shout out to Victoria Lum, who did our design. She does beautiful design work. Rachel Topham for her photography, and Jacqueline Arndt for her editing, because I always deeply believe in a good editor. I would also like to take a moment to thank the members of our board who joined us this evening. We have a few in the audience, so thank you for being here. It's a pleasure to have their support.
Thank you.
And for everyone, this is the last week of the exhibition, so it does close on Sunday. I hope you will return and join us in a few weeks for the opening of Hansum with Grace Han and Gloria Juyun Han, a ceramic art exhibition. So please come back on November 26th for the opening reception from 1:30 until 4 p.m. Thank you all, and I look forward to some more conversation.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for coming out.